you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. It's a wonderful one because it really tells us what the reset is about, right? The reset they're trying to implement, and that is they know very well the workers will be poorer and poorer. So the only way in which they will be able to continue to exist is by borrowing more and more and become enslaved to a monetary system controlled from above, fundamentally, right? I think that's why they are talking so. They're so excited about the central bank digital currencies, because that's one way in which they could really control the monetary flow and control whatever money one has in one's bank account.
Fabio Vighi is a professor at Cardiff University in the UK. I first encountered his work in a series of articles, and it really started to illuminate some of the potential economic underpinnings of the pandemic and the situations that we find ourselves in. Some of these lead down a path that looks very dystopic, but we also paint a picture of the parallel structures that lead to an optimistic revolution of the way that we understand money and how we use money to mediate relationship in community. This is a very interesting conversation, one extremely worthy of, at the very least, consideration and awareness of some of these huge titanic forces that are always at play under the surface of many of the decisions that are being made, whether consciously or unconsciously. So I encourage you guys to listen with an open mind and share your feedback. The truth is that we're all the master, we're all the healer, we're all the mystic.
Give it up one time for Aubrey Marcus.
Fabio, good to see you.
Good to see you, Aubrey.
So we have a very interesting story to tell today. And until I encountered your work, I had really no idea about any aspect of this particular way in which we could see some of the different challenges that we're facing right now as a culture. Really no window into this until I started reading your work. And of course, you're not the only one that's, had their eye on this for sure, but you just really write about it in a salient way. And the way I would like to start telling the story is to start telling the story with a white paper that was issued by a gigantic mega financial corporation called BlackRock. So for those people who don't know, tell us what BlackRock is.
Okay, BlackRock is the most powerful asset manager in the world today, together with Vanguard and another one. But basically, Vanguard and BlackRock, you will find them as major shareholders of the wealthiest companies in the world. So they really do control trillions of dollars. They manage them. They move them basically. They are extremely powerful also politically because they've kind of infiltrated, if you allow me to use this term, Biden's administration. They also sit in directly in the control room, as it were, in political terms. So in many ways, they represent this notion of stakeholder capitalism, which is today's, let's say, more widely known notion of contemporary capitalism, right? So where it's difficult to distinguish between politics and economics. We got a system with revolving doors, we could say, whereby the very powerful people in the financial system do manage to infiltrate politics directly, and it's a very opaque area where it's difficult to distinguish, who's really in control of things. But certainly BlackRock.
And this is also why, just to interrupt quickly, this is also why a lot of people have started calling them the fourth branch of
That's
government.
Right, yeah.
Just because of the amount of power that they hold in the financial sector and how so many things revolve around money, all the lobbying, all of the, campaign donations, everything. That's right. Everything is really moved by an economic engine.
That's right.
Economics are really at the center of so much of our culture and the way that people either consciously or subconsciously make their decisions, take their actions. Money is at the root of so many of the decisions that are being made. And I think people have a pretty good understanding of that. Like, all right, money is one of these forces that if you actually go down into the center, it's really at the center of a lot of our lives, our own personal lives. Money actually mediates between relationships, between people. A lot of the relationships we have are mediated by money, except in like the purest friendships and partnerships and forms of community. But money is like a real mediating strong force. And of course, it extends all the way through, politics and policy.
Right, through our institutions, right? So we often think that power, resides in our political institutions, right? We still have that sort of mind frame. We think that that's where power is. I think, as a matter of fact, today power is above those institutions, right? I mean, politicians are, in many ways, executing orders, to put it very bluntly, that they receive from this very powerful financial institutions themselves, and sometimes it's very difficult to say where the financial guy stops and where the politician begins. It's a kind of, as I said, opaque zone where it's difficult to distinguish between the two. More and more today.
It's almost
I
as
guess.
if money. A lot of people try to reduce this to people. Like they say, oh,
Right.
the elites and these people, but it's almost like money has a consciousness.
Right.
Money itself has a consciousness. It's like an entity, and that entity itself is potentially the most powerful entity that we have in our world. In many ways, more powerful than God in our culture, obviously.
Today,
right?
the economy is a sort of religion, right? It's a sort of religion that we all obey in many ways without even realizing that we do. So it's a kind of metaphysical entity. It's above us. It controls us deep down into our unconscious. It's the air we breathe. It's literally, it moves everything around us. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to think of a place, subjectivity, something that is not touched by that metaphysical entity. It's a kind of what philosophers often called in the past a real abstraction. It's abstract. It's, in a sense, a fiction, a narrative, but it's also totally real because it runs our lives completely. And you say that there's a consciousness there. I would say there's a kind of mechanism that is a sort of automatic subject. It works in a kind of automatic way, and it doesn't stop in front of anything ultimately, right? It's a sort of mechanical dynamic that has a mind of its own, right? Almost. And the thing is, we've internalized the categories, the values that let's say the universe of capital, as we can call it, has brought about. And that's beyond politics, it's beyond religion as we used to know it. It's something that is truly, I think, metaphysical insofar as it covers every aspect of our being. I could say ontological in philosophical terms. It kind of coincides with our being in the world, right? It's very difficult to escape it.
Let's take this example and let's continue with this metaphor and think of money like, and we know it's not, I think you described it perfectly as this abstraction, a very real abstraction, but let's assume that it's like an entity, because we understand that from a biological perspective. And an entity, when it's sick, it wants to heal itself, right? If an entity is sick and the entity is dying and the entity is stressed, it is going to do whatever it can to protect and heal itself. And BlackRock, as kind of like, let's call it the cerebral aspect of this entity to a certain degree, they identified in August 2019, to get back to where we started, they were like, hey, like the organism that we are the spokesperson for, or at least a spokesperson for, it's fucking sick and we have a big problem.
Right.
And so they write this whole white paper, and I've read the white paper, it's all online, we can put it in the show notes. They write a white paper, August 2019, and they say, look, the situation, the economics, money itself, it's sick, and there's a serious problem here, and we need a radical, unique solution in order to solve this problem. So summarize a bit what this white paper really was saying and like what it was pointing to, and then what the solution was. And then we'll go back in time to how
Right.
we got there. But
Yeah.
just let's start there at the paper.
Good. I think it's a really good starting point, because that paper is what really opened my eyes, in a sense, right? In a sense, I read that paper and I thought, okay, that's why we have COVID today, right? So we will get to COVID eventually. But I think that paper was telling the Fed, because it was, I think, meant to be read by the Fed in the first place, but was practically a paper that was saying the economy is about to hit the buffers. We know the system is about to crash, basically. We've had 10 days of expansion, of monetary expansion. 10 years.
10 years.
10 years of monetary expansion, which means continuous QEs, continuous quantitative easing monetary policies. And quantitative easing means effectively Federal Reserve, the American Central Bank, but also other central banks, injecting huge amounts of money into the financial sector in order to keep it afloat. And of course, keeping the interest rate, the cost of money, near zero, nailed, to near zero thereabouts. And that was what
these are almost like blood transfusions, right?
That's
it's
a
like
good
an
metaphor.
organism that was like almost dying, and it was like more blood transfusions.
Perfect
It's leaking
metaphor.
blood everywhere. But it's like, we got to stay alive. We got to stay huge and giant and full of steroids. And we need more fucking steroids, and we need more blood transfusions just to stay alive. And
that's a really good metaphor.
That's kind of quantitative easing.
That's right. That's what it is, right? And it started more or less after the 2008 crash in the US. It started a little later in Europe, but more or less then. So 10 years, 10, 11 years of blood transfusion nonstop, right? This kind of huge amounts of money injected. Obviously, it's about debt ultimately, right? It's about creating money out of thin air. First of all, crucial, artificial money creation programs. Artificial money. This is not money that comes from the real economy. It's money that is created by a computer in the Fed's room. By adding a few zeros to a certain number, you create money. Most of it is electronic money. You throw it into the system, and in exchange, you get junk securities, toxic assets, government bonds, whatever you want to buy from the financial sector. But the point is that you inject trillions, you inject billions, on a weekly basis into the system to keep it afloat, to make sure that there's money, enough money there, cheap money that people can borrow, that big investors can borrow, and they can run the machine, the speculative machine, right? They can create these bubbles. There's always, and the economy has functions through this monetary doping, right? What I call monetary doping. You call it blood transfusion. Mm-hmm. It's the same idea. It kept itself afloat basically for 10, 11 years until 2019, when things started going wrong again. This kind of crisis happened quite regularly, right? 2008, 2019, things suddenly were not working any longer, simply because that sort of quantitative easing system had sort of reached its internal limit. They drove the interest rates down to the point that they couldn't lower them any longer. They already reached zero.
What that does for people, and why that's important when you lower interest rates down to zero, it means that money can circulate really easily, seamlessly, quickly.
You can
borrow. And so there's available access to money, velocity, borrowing. All of that happens really, really fast and easy. So it's like it allows more, even though it's not new money creation, it allows access to money in a way that allows money to be loaned and debt to be increased and all of these things to happen as seamlessly as possible.
That's right.
As part of economic stimulus, whenever you wanted to stimulate the economy with more money circulating, the Fed always just lowers the rates.
You need to lower the rates so that money becomes more cheaper, easily available, and it sustains this debt-leveraged speculations, right? All these speculations are based on debt. So we get a hyper-indebted system. They need this constant flooding of money printed out of thin air, cheap money, to help them continue to expand, right? To inflate the bubbles that we find in the financial sector. And this, as I said, that was going on for 10 years or so, right? So for a long time. came to a point where it wasn't sustainable any longer. And that's what that paper that you mentioned, the BlackRock paper, referred to. The fact that that system wasn't sustainable any longer, there was going to be a recession, there was going to be what they call a downturn, a sudden downturn in the financial sector, with repercussions in the real economy, because it's all linked to this, a huge amount of value creation programs in the financial sector. So they sort of said, look, we've got to do something about this. We've got to make sure that the money that the Fed throws into the system goes directly to public and private spenders, and I'm quoting from that paper more or less. They say it's got to go, and they call that strategy going direct, right? So it's a kind of QE on steroids. It's something that kind of bypasses that debt creation system, and the money simply goes directly into the deposit. So they wanted to link the printer of the Federal Reserve directly to the deposits, to the accounts of the mega banks, the primary dealers. They got 24 primary dealers, investment banks, right? They're all investment banks, big banks, the mega banks, both in the US and internationally. Some of them like Deutsche Bank, PNB Paribas in Europe, Nomura Securities in Japan, and so on and so forth. So it's a global system. And they said, look, since this quantitative easing thing is not really working any longer, we lowered the rates to the point where we cannot make them negative, because otherwise there's no point. So we need to get the money directly to these people who need them so desperately in order to continue to speculate and to inflate the bubbles that, in a sense, sustain the whole system, right? So. There were, that's what they said to the Fed. But the Bank for International Settlements in June of the same year had already raised the alarm, as it were, right, about the coming downturn, that this system was not working any longer. And then a month after the white paper from the Fed, you get exactly sort of the crisis that you needed to apply this sort of stimulus, new form of stimulus, effectively.
And this is pretty, just to talk about how unique this going direct policy is. This is pretty radical.
It is.
It's a pretty radical solution, because they're saying we need to deliver money directly both to people themselves and to banks. But there's also a caveat. The problem is, if you do that, and why this is kind of an unprecedented, why doesn't the government just do this willy-nilly? First of all, you have to then justify it to the taxpayers, because ultimately you have to say, oh, well, we're using this money for a good reason. So you can't have public outrage like, well, hey, why are you just giving all of this money away, right? Like, this is going to cause massive inflation. You can't do this. This is devaluing all of our money, and you're just giving all of this money away. It wouldn't make sense to people. So they didn't have a real justification to do this, but they needed it. They called it helicopter money, like there was a fire.
Right.
They actually referred to it as that.
Yeah.
Like there's a fire in the forest, and you need to apply water. You just need to bring those helicopters full of water, douse the fire with water.
Yeah.
But you need a justification for that. You need people to realize, oh shit, there's a fire, we might burn down. So you need a justification for that. But they're also, at the same time, they're saying, well, fuck, this is also a challenge, because if we do this and we don't do it in exactly like the right way, then we're going to create massive, massive hyperinflation. And this is going to be uncontrollable. So there's a couple conditions that they talk about of like, all right, we need to go direct, give everybody money. And also we need to make sure that money doesn't actually circulate in a way that causes massive hyperinflation, which is another economic disaster for everybody.
Right. I think, first of all, we need to say that, yes, the expansion, this massive monetary expansion in relation to previous QEs had already started in September 2019. So that's when the repo market sort of crashed, and they needed to inject money in order to restore some kind of credibility and make sure that people would lend again, right? Because there was a liquidity trap in the repo market. Maybe we can talk about that a bit later. But
yeah, just real quickly, what is the repo market?
Repo stands for repurchase agreement. Basically, contracts where investment funds like BlackRock and big banks exchange money. against collateral. So, for example, you're in desperate need of liquidity because you need to invest in the derivatives market or wherever you want to invest, and you can get that liquidity in the repo market in exchange of some like security, for example, right? A treasury. Mostly, it's a treasury. It's a government treasury, and the idea is that you repay back that money with some interest within 24 hours. So it's really kind of immediate liquidity that you can get on the market when you really need it quite desperately, but you have to pay back. Normally it's overnight, so it's within 24 hours, but it can also be extended, obviously. So there was a problem there because all of a sudden rates went up from 2% to 10%. All of a sudden, people, big banks stopped lending, and therefore that could have had a massive contagion over all the other speculative markets, right? Because if something breaks down there, then you have the infection, to use that metaphor, extending and spreading through all other markets.
It's organ failure. If the blood can't flow, then organs start to fail. Exactly. If the organs start to fail, the whole organism can start to collapse, right? So this kind of repo, it allows blood to circulate. It's like the heart that just keeps pumping the blood that's in there.
It's massive. You're thinking about $1-2 trillion again exchanged there on a daily basis. So it's pretty huge market. It's part of the so-called interbanking lending system, which is a kind of shadow banking system, but it does, work at the heart of the financial industry, as it were. So if something goes wrong there, it's a problem, and it can happen very quickly. So that provided the good reason, the good excuse, if you like, the good reason for the Fed to begin this going direct strategy. And the exact figures are coming out now, 2 years later. Because the Fed has this agreement where they don't make them public straight away. You have to wait two years more or less to know exactly how much money, and especially who this money went to. So who was the beneficiary of these massive going direct sort of types of lending, which are not supposed to the Fed are not supposed to do, because it's not about that, but they do it anyway, obviously because they have to save the Titanic, from sinking.
Right.
And that's what they did in 2019. And what I want to say is that they expanded their own balance sheet of about 4.5 trillion within the last quarter of 2019. Right. So if you look at the graph, it's more or less horizontal, and then it goes up like that, the last quarter. So the balance sheet goes up hugely, which means that they've created all this money and they've invested it, they've inserted it, they've pumped it into the financial sector, they've given it to the mega banks or the primary dealers, and that sort of in the attempt to salvage the market from implosion effectively. And of course that went on and on and on with in 2020 as well, under pandemic cover, as it were, under pandemic shield, because then that was justified.
So this gets very interesting, and this is where obviously someone could say this is a crazy conspiracy theory, and we'll talk about conspiracy theories, but ultimately, what ends up happening, whether by serendipity or whether by unconscious behavior, capitalizing on some unique opportunity that they had. But basically this pandemic, for whatever reason, it happens. It starts hitting the world in January, February of 2020. People start becoming aware of COVID, and then all of a sudden the lockdowns start to happen. And the lockdowns start to happen, which then at that point, all of the middle level of the economy, all of the businesses, everybody, all of that gets shut down. And then simultaneously, right after that, stimulus money starts to flow. Right. And this is another very acute way that they were going direct. They were going direct by actually putting money in the pockets of everyday consumers. Stimulus money is just pouring into the economy. But the other condition, which is we can't have this money circulating around to everybody and all of these small businesses, inflation will just go
Right.
crazy. But the economy was actually frozen.
Right.
It was frozen by lockdown, and a bunch of money was dropped in, and that both prevented inflation and also allowed all of this additional stimulus to get into the
Right.
economy. So it was this very kind of Cinderella, magical way in which both of the conditions for the BlackRock paper, like two of the conditions at least, were really met. One, there was a good excuse to deliver a bunch of money, and also there was a way to prevent that money from
Right.
circulating in a way that it would
Yeah.
cause hyperinflation.
The problem would be if all that money turns into real demand, right, for people to spend, because that real demand would cause inflation to surge very, very quickly. And I think that they wanted to avoid that, and they wanted also to avoid raising rates, because that would have been the other problem. The moment you get inflation, you also immediately have the problem of trying to tackling inflation by hiking interest rates, right? Which is exactly the problem we have today. But what what COVID allowed them to do was, first of all, I would say, ultimately to kick the can down the road, and to make sure that those problems, inflation with potential for hyperinflation and rate hikes, were postponed effectively, so that they didn't have to think about it then. They could just concentrate on replenishing the financial sector, making sure that everything was restored in the financial sector, while inflation and the rate hike issue were postponed, as I said, right? And so this kind of freezing or the cooling down of the economy prevented it from overheating, and therefore, potentially creating huge inflation issues. And also, it gave them time to do what they had to do, to print and print and print, and throw all this money, like gallons of water, as you said, on a fire that is developing, very quickly in the forest, and that sort of allowed them not so much to solve the problem, but effectively to postpone it, I would say, whilst avoiding the worst type of consequences. Mostly hyperinflation, I think, right? But hyperinflation means devaluation of money, fundamentally, of fiat currency, devaluation. And I think that's more or less what we are going to have to face now and in the future, right? There's no way that we are not going to face the issue of money devaluation, because we've created so much, because our system is so dependent on these artificial money creation programs, that the imbalance that they create in the system cannot be solved anymore, right? The system is not supposed to run on money created out of nowhere, out of thin air. The system is supposed to run on money that comes from investment in labor. That's how capitalism as a social system, as a social bond, actually works. This is the kind of question that every child, asks. I asked it to my father. I remember, why, if we need all this money, why can't they print it and give it to us so we can spend it, and there's no poverty and everybody's happy, right? You probably asked it yourself. I think every child asks that question. Why do we have to work to get money? Why doesn't the government just print money and give it to us, right? But obviously, my father told me, right, but that would cause inflation. And I thought, what's inflation? I don't understand. It took me ages to understand what actually that meant. The idea being that's not the value of money in a capitalist system comes from a specific relationship between money itself and labor. So only by investing in labor to produce commodities that are then sold on the market and they realize profits, do you create wealth in a capitalist system, right? And the moment you add or you create money from the outside, fictitious money created, by a computer or by a printer, by a central bank printer, then you immediately create some kind of imbalance. You undermine, basically, the foundations of a capitalist society. And I think that's what we're doing.
But at the same time, what it does allow for, it allows for massive wealth creation in the financial
As
sector.
well.
So outside of the what we could call, quote, the real economy, which is people working jobs, making products and making things, offering services, ways in which their efforts are then rewarded with money. Instead of that just typical process, there's this whole gigantic world of a financial sector where people are getting extraordinarily wealthy by actually leveraging the creation of new money and the speculation of this money. And then we have this massive, massive sector of millionaires, billionaires, people and corporations that are actually benefiting greatly from this creation of money. And it creates this massive, financial window of opportunity for a whole new kind of enterprise and a whole new type of capitalism to take hold, which is financial capitalism. And these people then have all of this money, and of course they do spend it. They buy homes, they buy things, they circulate some of the money as well. But all of this money is predicated on the creation of ever more greater amounts of money and ever greater amounts of speculation. And that's why there becomes ultimately a bubble. And when people talk about bubbles, it's like all of this kind of money that's all leveraged and all indebted and all of this stuff. In a bubble, that bubble can burst. And then all of that starts to collapse into the real economy again, of like, what is actually there? What do we actually have? What are we actually doing? Who's actually producing
because
things?
By now the real economy is very much is on the drip almost of the financial sector. So it's on credit, right? So it all depends on the banks lending money to businesses so that they can invest it and make some sort of profit out of it and create some sort of real wealth. But it depends on credit and the credit system, the financial system, is growing disproportionately in relation to the real economy. So we've got the growth of huge financial bubbles and the contraction of the real economy more and more. That's the disproportion I'm talking about. And that, to me, this is not like the result of some kind of criminal activity, right? It's not just some criminal guys who wanted to make more money. There's also that aspect, of course, because people will try to do that. Mm-hmm. But it's a systemic issue, I think, as far as I'm concerned. It's not, because the idea is that the only way in which capitalism can actually work today more and more is precisely through this process of financialization. Like we cannot rebalance it. We cannot go back to the post-war period where the real economy was flourishing. There was more distribution of wealth. Things were functioning differently. Today, for this system to work, it needs to develop in this disproportionate way, where all this value is created in the financial sector and less in the real economy. So there's an internal dynamic that is pushing, us to live in that way and pushing the system in that direction. And I think that's what, to me, is really crucial, is the idea that the real economy is slowly contracting inevitably because capital invests less and less in labor, finds labor investment less and less profitable. Why?
Yeah,
that's the big question for me. And the reason, my answer to that is that automation, the process of technological automation, which has been exponential in recent years, with the third industrial revolution, microelectronics, digitalization, and now we are going towards the fourth industrial revolution, of course, right? Artificial intelligence. So that process of technological innovation has made more and more labor redundant, more and more labor superfluous, insofar as it's not needed. Machines can do the job of productivity. They can produce much more than humans can, right? And therefore, capital that is always seeking to cut costs in order to remain competitive, right? Individual capitals end up shedding more labor, eliminating more labor than what they can reabsorb into the system. And that is what ultimately determines the contraction of the real economy and the compensatory mechanism whereby we need to inflate the financial sector more and more to create the sort of value that the system needs in order to reproduce itself, that the societies need in order to reproduce themselves. So my issue is not just there's some bad people doing some very bad things in the financial sector. Yes, there are. The Fed and the BlackRock guy, they're all, bad people in many ways. But the system is kind of grinding to a halt by itself because it's increasingly unable to produce wealth through its original recipe, through its fundamental recipe, which is very simple. It's money that creates more money through labor, through the mediation of labor. Labor is the mediator for money to increase itself.
And also it allows the distribution of this wealth. Instead of it, when everything is automated, then you have a corporation, giant corporation, Google, Apple, Amazon, all of these things, which do employ people. Let's say they obviously still do, but the delta, the difference between how much money is actually going out to the workers versus how much money is being accumulated to the kind of mega billionaires and the mega billionaire trillionaire corporations that we have, there becomes an ever increasing gap where the super wealthy are getting super wealthier, but the people who are working are actually not actually getting that access to that money. So it's helpful for a very, very, very minute portion of the world.
Just an example: Apple has a market cap of $2.8 trillion. Right, it's huge market cap. So that's the value it has on the market, and it employs 100,000 people. Right, there's a huge disproportion between the labor involved in the production, and the value of that company. There's a huge disproportion, and that is not sustainable. Just look at that. It's not sustainable because how is society supposed to reproduce itself if so few people are working, or are working in terms of producing value, right? And they're working not as precarious workers, because precarious workers don't produce much value for society. They need to be paid good wages in order for that value to be created for society. But less and less of that happens because the labor commodity, as it were, is not as profitable as it used to be. The reason for that is because machines have been replacing labor more and more, and there's nothing we can do about it. Like, this is really nothing we can do. I don't think there's nothing we can do about it because, it's in the nature of our economic system to try and cut costs in order to be competitive. And the best way they can do that today is by employing machines instead of humans to work, to produce. So the productivity potential is huge with technology, huge productivity potential. But that also means that there's a lot of people who are out of the system or who don't really contribute to it, and therefore there's a problem of a surplus humanity that somewhat, it's not really producing any longer. It's not receiving real wages, is not really receiving the amount of money they need to reproduce themselves socially, and therefore what to do with them, right? This is really the problem of the future for a capitalist society.
Okay, so to summarize some of the things that we've been talking about, one of the things that we were mentioning is, you mentioned that there's, potentially bad actors in the system, right? And the bad actors are actually manipulating these strings. However, for them, they probably don't think they're bad actors because they're such a product of the machine itself, and all they know is the machine. All they know is the economic engine that they've created. And then when they look at what happens if they stop this economic engine, they look at it and they say, it's a fucking disaster. So we just have to keep this going at all costs. So they have all of the justification in order to do so. It's almost like a nuclear reactor, right? Like, if they shut it down, then the nuclear reactor cores might overheat, and then all of a sudden there's going to be all this spilling of radioactive energy. So instead of keeping this kind of toxic nuclear plant going, so they're keeping the toxic nuclear plant going, but they realize, like, well, fuck, if we stop, it's a disaster, right? So that's probably the justification that they have in their mind. But what they're missing is it's really like a poverty of imagination, and the poverty of imagination is like, well, we've run this game for a long time. The game has worked It's been the best economic system that we could create. We ran it for a long time. Technological advances, the way that the system works, it's just coming up against its logical ends. And now we need to be creative and come up with another solution. But in order for people to think about that, well, first of all, they have to have imagination. Second of all, they would have to trust people to be able to innovate, because the solution isn't something that could come top down. They would have to trust that innovation would emerge. And we'll talk a little bit more about some ways in which we can imagine this other system that likely is inevitable to emerge anyways. And all of these transfusions and all of these steroid shots that they're doing really won't ultimately work, but it's just kind of pushing the ball down the line.
Right.
So that's kind of the position that they find themselves in. But let's go back real quick too. I want to summarize some of the things that you had written. So we talked about they needed to go direct. BlackRock needed to go direct. They needed to deliver money directly into the economy. And then also they needed to prevent that from circulating through the real economy to prevent inflation. So you write, with lockdowns came the suspension of business transactions, which drained the demand for credit and stopped the contagion of inflation. In other words, restructuring the financial architecture through extraordinary monetary policy was contingent on the economy's engine being turned off. Had the enormous mass of liquidity pumped into the financial sector reached transactions on the ground, a monetary tsunami with catastrophic consequences would have been unleashed. So again, we get to this very unique situation. Money needs to be pumped in, and also certain aspects of the way that money circulates need to be frozen. For whatever reason, COVID provided both of those criteria to be met. And then, so what ends up happening? So what happens? You write this as well. As anticipated, it has allowed the Fed to reorganize the financial sector by printing a continuous stream of billions of dollars out of thin air, actually trillions. And that's what's happened. It has accelerated the extinction of small and medium-sized companies, allowing major groups to monopolize trade flows. It has further depressed labor wages and facilitated significant capital savings through smart working, which is particularly smart for those who implement it. It has enabled the growth of e-commerce, the explosion of big tech, and the proliferation of the pharma dollar, which also includes the much disparaged plastic industry, now producing millions of new face masks and gloves every week, many of which end up in the oceans. And you say this as well, we could talk about this, to the delight of the Green New Dealers. In 2020 alone, the wealth of the planet's 2,200 or so billionaires grew by 1.9 trillion, an increase without historical precedent. All of this thanks to a pathogen that obviously we know the story about what happened with COVID. So lots of conditions were met, and then a lot of result happened from those conditions being met, which really meant that the uber wealthy absorbed so much more of the capital that was actually went direct. All of this helicopter money was meant to go to the ground. It was meant to infiltrate in through the whole ecosystem, but it went just right back up to these massive storage tanks, the massive 2,200 storage tanks of money, that instead of actually putting out the fire, now we just have even larger storage tanks of money, which are these, 2,200 or so and more. It's not like exactly that. It's just more wealth is accumulated into the super, super wealthy, and less to the actual ground that needs the replenishment of the topsoil and the, mycological ecosystem. Everything that needs to actually happen didn't really happen in a productive way. Now just the uber wealthy got more uber wealthy. Right. And that's obviously, so let's say that those uber wealthy have the ability through BlackRock and through other things to manipulate the current system. It doesn't have to be a conspiracy. They could be saying, look, we got to save the economy. And the unconscious desire for them to continue to accumulate wealth, which we all have. We all have an unconscious desire, however good we are, there's a part of us that wants to grow and become as big as we individually possibly can. It's the nature of our separate self. It's the nature of our ego that wants to become as powerful, wealthy, safe as possible. So unconsciously, this whole process happened. And that's another thing that you say beautifully. If there is an unconscious, conspiracy and manipulation are inevitable. All that is required is that there's unconscious and subconscious desires by people who have great resources to create solutions that help them accumulate more resources. Right. It doesn't have to be a nefarious plan by the elites.
I think we need to understand that the system fundamentally, since it started a few hundred years ago, it started on a very specific premise. The premise is money creating more money, right? This is the fundamental principle of our economic system and of our world, more generally, of our universe as we know it. It's based on a very simple idea: money that creates more money. And how does it do it? How did it come about? Thanks to people, free workers, so-called free workers, right? The liberation of the slaves, of the serfs. Suddenly they were free, but free to do what? Free to sell their labor power. And that's the mediator that allows money to become more money in a capitalist system. So that's the drive. This is a kind of a desire, but also an unconscious drive, right? That drives everything that we know. It creates all the categories that we know, all the values that we know. When you think of the good values of our society, democracy, when you think of even solidarity in a certain way, even other values, right? Obviously, the market and so on. These are all values that have emerged in modernity from that moment on, when we went from a feudal society to a capitalist society, when sort of modern capitalist modernity was invented, and then it took time for it to become dominant, obviously, right? Because for a while there was an overlap of feudal system with capitalist, with new modern capitalist system. But then, especially through the industrial revolutions, first industrial revolution in the beginning of the 19th century with the steam engine, second industrial revolution, particularly with the Fordist system in the beginning of the 20th century, then third industrial revolution, those categories, which are capitalist categories, are more and more internalized and become more and more dominant. They become who we are fundamentally, right? This is something that we should never forget. It's not just bad guys versus good guys. In a sense, we're all driven by the same values, right? No matter how good we are, ultimately, there's that desire or drive that is linked, connected with the systemic drive. And the systemic drive is not about the distribution of wealth. Fundamentally, it's about the creation of more money through investment. You invest money in labor originally in order to create more money. And then there are some collateral sort of events, and some of them are good, like the distribution, the trickling down of money, whatever. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But these are kind of epiphenomena. They're not really what capitalism is about. Capitalism is a blind, anonymous drive which has to do with the creation of money, right? That's it. And then all the rest comes as a bonus almost, right? Yes, sometimes we get democratic organization, distribution, blah, blah, blah. We've had it, it failed. Then we've had neoliberalism. Now we are in a phase where the 0.01% owns everything and the others are, struggling. I'm simplifying a little, but, this kind of disproportionate. But at the heart of it all, there is that fundamental recipe, that fundamental drive, which has to do with the multiplication of money fundamentally, right? And that's why it works also in the financial industry, because it's the same drive. It's only that originally it has to do with the mediation of labor, right? So it's money, labor, capital. Whereas in the financial sector, labor doesn't need to exist. It's just money that creates money by itself. It's like the self-creation of money, the speculative creation of money, right? Without labor. And I think that's where we're having the problems, because we are eliminating the substance of capitalism itself. Labor is, like it or not, the substance of capitalist societies. If we take that away, then you really have a problem. You cannot have a capitalist society sustained only by the financial system. It's impossible. And they know that. They know that very well, that they cannot get rid of completely of labor, right? They cannot. Otherwise it's not capitalism any longer. It becomes some kind of tyranny. It becomes some sort of, totalitarian system where very few people really are in charge of the monetary flow, and all the others are reduced to slaves again. So we go back to a kind of new feudal world, right?
Which is also similar. It's also similar to how the communist regimes of the past played out, where the state actually and state appointed oligarchs in certain situations controlled all of the wealth, and then it was really a different form of feudalism where there was a lot of people working very hard, having very little, and then state controlled power that tried to decide and make all of the decisions and figure everything out. And that failed. So then capitalism was like, all right, this is a much better solution. And it does work. It works for creativity. It allows for infinite flexibility and also capitalizes on the collective intelligence rather than centralized intelligence.
That's right.
And so it worked for a long time. And then all of a sudden, but just because of natural forces, the forces of technology, that system no longer is serving. And so people in the financial sector, they're smart and they're recognizing that this game, they're not dumb.
No.
You know, that's one of all the things, of all the insults we can lob at them. It's not that they're dumb, right? Like that's not the case. You can say that about a lot of different areas. Politics, you can be like, that's kind of dumb. But ultimately in the financial sector, they're smart. So then you have people like, you know, like Klaus and the World Economic Forum. They start putting out these very strange, cryptic ideas about
scary,
about the way that the Great Reset, all the way things are going to go forward. You will own nothing and you will be happy. What the fuck are they even talking about?
That's wonderful.
Like what? How does that even make sense, right? But in some ways, if you get into their mind and you think, oh shit, they know that the system cannot sustain itself any longer. So what is their solution? Well, all they know is control. All they know is control. Yeah. That's all they know. They've controlled their companies. They've controlled their businesses. They have this inflated idea of their own mind and their own brain power. And they think, you know what? If we actually controlled everything and kept it away from the stupid people, you know, in this mindset, like we're the smart ones, we kept it away from the stupid people, then we could control everything completely. And if we could control everything completely, it would all work. Well, it doesn't fucking work that way. It can't work. But you can get in the mindset of them thinking like, what we need is more control.
Right.
And so this becomes this kind of slippery slope of justification towards a totalitarian dystopia. And that's something that, you know, really you write about with great trepidation of where this could potentially lead with central bank digital currency. So take us down this trajectory of dystopia that, you know, really you're afraid that we may be navigating towards. And then we'll talk about the ways to get off that bus and try to create a new system.
Right. I think that's the trajectory, you know, that's the inevitable trajectory. If we follow the capitalist line, you know, the capitalist drive in the current situation where more and more labor becomes redundant and there's no need for labor for mass labor any longer. We end up with a lot of the population being superfluous, and they need somehow to be controlled and given some kind of reason to exist, right? Unless they get rid of us, you know. There's other solutions we don't want to even think about, right? The eugenetics, etc., eugenics rather, and so on. But I think the WEF advert is a wonderful one, really, and it's unfortunate for them that they put it out. They got rid of it straight away, almost, you know, after people started talking about it. But you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. It's a wonderful one because it really tells us what the reset is about, right? The reset they're trying to implement, and that is they know very well the workers will be poorer and poorer. So the only way in which they will be able to continue to exist is by borrowing more and more and become enslaved to a monetary system controlled from above, fundamentally, right? And I think that's why they are talking they're so excited about the central bank digital currencies, because that's one way in which they could really control the monetary flow and control whatever money one has in one's bank account. You know, they can actually give the money to the people who are out of work. You know, think about all these universal benefit, you know, UBIs programs for people who are unemployed, etc. I think those will be the first ones to on the receiving end of this kind of monetary slavery program that it's in the making, in a way, right? And CBDCs are the perfect tool to implement it. because with central bank digital currencies, they've got they say that. They say we have the technology to implement this and to control people, to control what people spend, the amount of money that they have in the bank account. We are giving them the money, and therefore we have the right to control everything they do. In a post-work society, right, in a post-labor society, this for them seems to be the natural solution. People will rent, will not own anything. They might be able to rent if they behave, if they do the things that we tell them to do, right? If they don't consume in a certain way, if you pay the taxes, taxes in a certain way, if they don't. So everything will be about controlling people, and I think it will also be about some kind of humanitarian justification for that. Right? They can't just impose it by brute force. They'll have to find some sort of humanitarian justification, whether it's climate change or something else or some kind of emergency. That's why I call it emergency capitalism, because it's all based on that justification. They need to justify why we can't spend, why we need to stay at home, why we can't go to work, why we have to consume in a certain way, why we have to be so. To me, that's the direction. It's very clear to me that that's the way we're going, because we are kind of exiting the work society of the past. We are entering another type of capitalism, which is very dark, very, very dark, and that it's prone to implosions. Maybe even a market crash could be the beginning for this new type of monetary slavery that in a sense is in the making, based on mass unemployment or mass underemployment, of course, right? I mean, this is what we have to deal with here ultimately with CBDCs as well. They are the solution for them to this inevitable, I think, drive towards a post-work capitalist society where
so in this paradigm, just so people are clear, so there's a central bank digital currency, which is not too dissimilar from the currency that we currently have, but it's the central bank just absolutely having full autonomy over the entire money supply. Yeah. And then where it gets really nefarious is we've already seen the creation of vaccine passports, which a lot of people talk about, is the kind of the entryway, the door that's opening towards a digital ID. And this is something that's already occurring in China with social credit scores and the ability for every single person to have a digital identification, and then based upon their actions, whether the government likes the actions or doesn't like the actions, they can control the population. So the control that already exists in another part of the world, that formula could actually start to creep into the West. And it could creep into the West through vaccine passports, then becoming digital IDs, and then extending beyond vaccination into other policies like what food you eat, how much you drive, what decisions you make. Also dystopian, in a dystopian world, also what comments you make, right, what things you say on social media, what protests you, and of course if they linked it to the phone, then you would know, and you had to leave it on, then they would know where you are, whether you were participating in something. And so you get this potentiality of absolute control and this total dystopia. I mean, it becomes very Orwellian at this point. Now, there was a lot of people who were saying, oh, vaccine passports, it's all a fucking conspiracy theory. It's never going to, well, it's already started to happen. So these next steps can happen. It's not that they can't happen. We don't know if they will. Who knows? Yeah. But like that way in which it could happen is fucking terrifying, because that is this dystopia of total control where nobody actually has any leverage anymore. We don't have actually our own economic wealth and power. It's all controlled and mediated by a single authoritarian, totalitarian source.
I think, with especially with vaccine passport, people don't realize, right, the potential they have. It's the first step, potentially, right? It's the first step towards this kind of digitalization of life that will become more and more a way of controlling us. It's not necessarily the end in itself. It's only the beginning of the installation of this digital infrastructure, which will be more and more linked to our identities, and therefore will be able to control us more and more completely. So it's only opening the door to this new world, right, that awaits us out there, the vaccine passports. And it's a huge step to convince people that they need it, It's a huge victory for them already, regardless of whether they will continue or not this year, or they will be dismissed and whatever, they're already there. They've already broken that taboo, as it were, right? So they will easily continue. They can force us to use them again. For, there's another pandemic or another emergency. Here we are. We already done it in the past. We can do it again, and that allows them to gain ground on what they want to do.
Yeah, once they have access to this technology,
Right.
then the fear is, like, if you have access to more control, the natural inclination when you're in the myth of control is that if you have access to control, you're going to use it. And every time that the government has been granted access, or any large body really has been granted access to power and control, we've typically seen them utilize and wield this power and control, which is also why all of the founding documents of our nation and so many of the great thinkers warned against the natural inclination of tyranny to go to ever greater levels of control. And we're not saying that that's for sure what's happening, or that's the only way, but it becomes a possibility, and with the possibility there comes danger.
It becomes a very real possibility. They will encounter huge problems. It's not an easy one. The infrastructure is huge in itself. They have to wait for the right moment to implement it. Because people, at some point they will sort of realize that it's not necessary, that you don't have to do that. So they need the right emergency, the right crisis, maybe a huge market crash, much worse than 2008, reducing people to poverty and therefore forcing people to accept these conditions. It could happen that way, but there has to be the right timing. They have to have the right moment. They have to do it at the right moment when the infrastructure is ready. It's a huge infrastructure. It's not easy for central banks to control everybody's bank account, even in technological terms, right? It's not that easy. So it's something in the making, but we have to be aware that that's the trajectory. That's where we're going, little by little.
If they had artificial intelligence,
yes,
that was controlled, then all of a sudden it gets way easier. Yeah. It gets way easier to make these controls. They pipe in the directives into an artificial intelligence machine, and then all of a sudden it's actually very precise exactly how they're able to control and how they're able to maneuver the infrastructure. So that's another potential danger.
So important to keep some kind of critical awareness, right? To be aware of these things and to reject certain forms of blackmail, even like moral blackmail, emotional blackmail. We shouldn't give in to this. We should keep some kind of autonomy, critical autonomy somehow, and we should form some sort of resistance to this, right? I mean, it's quite simple. Without some sort of disruption or resistance to this, there's no emancipation for us. We're gonna follow in line more and more to what we're told to do. So that's what's really been frustrating for me over the last 2 years, I have to say, right? The ease with which they've done what they wanted to do, and people have just followed. And I know you talked about this before with Professor Desmet, for example, Matthias Desmet. So I don't want to go back there, but
the way that you talk about this is powerful, because you're talking about how as soon as you start asking these questions, you're labeled as a conspiracy theorist. And then as soon as you're labeled as a conspiracy theorist, then all of a sudden, all of the questions that you're asking can be discarded.
Exactly.
And you say the epistemology of conspiracy theory drives much of today's propaganda as a rhetoric of exclusion. The a priori rejection of paranoid thinking leaves the official narrative as the sole bearer of truth, irrespective of empirical verification.
Thank you for that.
And so this is coming across in so many different ways, whether you're talking about it from a medical perspective. All right, what is the virtue of vaccination versus non-vaccination? What's the virtue of mask versus non-mask? There's this idea that you either follow science and the truth, or you're a conspiracy theorist. And if you're a conspiracy theorist, you're also some right-wing fascist, blah, blah, blah. They put all of these other things to actually dehumanize and desensitize people to actually the critical thinking, which is essential.
Yeah.
Essential. For science itself is essential.
That's the blackmail I was referring to, right? I'm not going to give in to that blackmail. I don't care if they call me a conspiracy theorist. I want to keep open the possibility of doubt and critique without being labeled a conspiracy theorist. without being excluded from
Too
public
late.
debate. I
Too
know
late.
it's too late.
We've already been labeled.
I know it's too late, but at least we're here talking about it, right? So there's still
Yeah,
some
for
space,
sure.
and we need to make the most of it. But yeah, the label will be there. It's an easy game for them, right? They come up with some, it's a way of generalizing of especially it's a way of making sure that there are no disagreements with regard to the official line, right? Everybody should follow the official line. Everybody else who has doubts, who wants to express doubts, is immediately disqualified by being called a conspiracy theorist, right? And all the list
Yeah.
of adjectives and attributions that go along with it that you mentioned, because all of a sudden you become a right-wing extremist. All of a sudden you become a racist. All of a sudden you become a sexist. All of a sudden you become some kind of, there's so many of them, right? Crazier and crazier. And just because you've raised your hand and said, look, wait a second, let's talk about it again. I have some doubts. Tell me this, tell me. So you cannot even have doubts any longer. That's the big problem today for critical thinking.
Yeah. And also, and just to be fair, on the other side, one of the interesting things is that everybody who tends to be more liberal, or let's say supports vaccination, you can have your own beliefs about vaccination, you could like it. All of a sudden, they're being labeled and they're being slumped into a category. Oh, this is a communist. These are communists that are shills for for China or something like that, or they're a sheep, or they're this other category. So we're creating this system in which nobody's really talking to each other. Everybody is just trying to ad hominem attack the individual rather than take the dialogue itself, this kind of Hegelian dialectic, this Socratic, review of what is actually happening. Let's all just talk about this. Let's see what might be happening. Let's look at all the facts. Let's look at the timelines. Let's see everything that's going on, and let's talk about it. And let's see if maybe we need to speak as a voice of the people and as a voice collectively to say, no, I don't think we want to go this way. I think we need to go this way. And that's how a democracy itself is supposed to work. But they don't want that. Is like the people speak.
They want to polarize.
Right.
They want people to fight people, because they want a polarized situation. Because that's the best way for them to rule, right? When there's divide et impera, divide and rule. This is what they've created very, very well with the no-vax, the anti-vax, and the pro-vax. They've created two categories: the fighting each other and allowing them to continue with whatever they're doing. They created a perfect scapegoat, in the anti-vax, right, or whatever. They label everybody as an anti-vax who has doubts, and even great scientists, and Nobel Prize winners, even them are labeled as anti-vax. So they polarize public opinion. They prevent debate from taking place. We've seen that in mainstream media, the way they've operated. So it's very hard not to think that there's some kind of planning behind this, right? Without wanting to be a conspiracy theorist, but a degree of planning is necessary. Or maybe serendipity, as you said, right? But it becomes more and more difficult to believe it because they've created a situation that suits them perfectly, right? They can blame the anti-vax, even if 70% of the population is now vaccinated, right? But they still, in many countries, they still keep on blaming those who haven't taken the vaccine for the infections and everything.
I think you said it really well. You said this is the first time in history that the failure of a treatment is blamed on the people who don't take the treatment, right? Like, so the treatment was promised to end the pandemic and to prevent people from getting COVID, but instead of it going like, oh, well, I guess that didn't really happen, especially with Omicron and some of these other, well, shit, that didn't actually work. But instead of it saying like, well, shit, the vaccines didn't work as promised, they're switching it and saying, the problem is the people who didn't take the treatment. That's why the treatment isn't working. It's
absolutely crazy.
And it's kind of this wild manipulation of logic. Like, what?
And yet people fall for it.
How does that make sense?
And yet most people fall for it. They want to be on the right side of history. I think they just fall for it out of conformity. They want to conform. They want to be on the right side of power. Some of them are naive, I guess. Some of them are opportunistic. But I've also questioned myself, why do people go along with all this when it's so blatantly obvious that there are so many contradictions in the official line that we should at least doubt them? right? But people just go along. Most people, at least,
Mhm.
just go along, and then obviously it becomes a question of human nature, I guess. And but
Yeah,
I find it. I've struggled over the last 2 years, right? You know, I've lost friends
sure.
over this.
Many of
Yeah,
us have.
I guess
Yeah,
most of
many
us
of us
have.
have.
Yeah. So, but at least I've made new friends as well, which is important, and I've been able to express myself. And
Hmm. Yeah. So if we look forward to, some more optimistic ideas of where this could actually go and what could actually transpire, I think all pressure creates adaptation, right?
yeah,
Like we probably wouldn't have changed anything. Of course, we wouldn't have changed anything if everything was working. Like we're not going to change anything in 2015 when things are still working
mm,
as far as
mm,
everybody can feel. Well, shit, it's
mm,
everything's working, or even 2004 or 1995 or all of
yeah,
these different points. We're like, yeah, it's fucking still working. That's we know that we're piling on debt, but nonetheless, the debt doesn't seem to bother us. Everything's working. But now we have pressure, and more pressure could be coming. And the prayer is obviously for as smooth a transition as possible. But it seems like the system itself is not going to be able to sustain itself in the way that we know it. So a new system needs to emerge. And we started talking about this, about an alternate parallel structure that potentially is already in its
right,
infancy of forming and potentially could involve cryptocurrency as one way, which is by its very nature, at least we believe it is decentralized, right? So it's decentralized, so it's not subject to the same kind of Fed manipulation. There's a fixed amount of Bitcoin, for example, and if people move into an alternate structure of using that as a currency, yeah, it's not going to solve everything. We're not saying crypto is the solution for everything, but it's just an interesting facet of what's at the same time as all of this other stuff. It's also developing in parallel. It's almost like the solution in its infancy potentially is developing at the same time by grace, right? By grace, at the same time, the kernel of a solution is appearing at the same time that the pressure is being applied to the structure as it stands. And so it's interesting that those two things have coincided and really speaks to potentially even the intelligence of the universe in a way. It's like, all right, this thing needs to change. A lot of pressure on this side of the game and a lot of things that if you look carefully, you can see through. And then some potential opportunity on the other
yeah.
side.
I think the contradiction basically cannot be hidden any longer, right? There's a negativity in the system that is emerging and is creating suffering. It's creating a lot of suffering for a lot of people, and people despite the emergency tactic, despite the emergency strategies, right? The fact that there's been the pandemic, etc. People are realizing that the system is kind of breaking at the seams. Something is not functioning any longer. The contradiction is you cannot contain it anymore. I think we're coming slowly to the end of this form of life that was capitalist modernity, right? I think we're coming to the end of it. It's kind of dying out by itself, not because of external forces, but it's reaching the internal limit of its expansion. Even in terms of, you can think of expansion in terms of imperialism. Where else can we go? We've already kind of conquered the whole world, right? In the sense that we've commodified the whole world. There's nowhere else to go unless we go on Mars or something, with another planet, try to do something else there. But we've reached the
Yeah,
limit.
and a lot of other strategies that we've used, including the military-industrial
Right.
complex, war
Even
itself.
war.
War is a very powerful economic engine where you're creating things with the real economy, creating bullets and
Yeah.
bombs and guns and mobilizing troops and traveling this way and that way and consuming fuel and doing all of these different things, moving troops this way, building airplanes, all of this stuff, and then those airplanes explode and the bombs explode and these things explode, and then so that wealth evaporates, and then you create more, and then people are being employed, and then but it's of course as toxic. It's as toxic a
Today,
structure.
especially with the kind of weapons that we have, right? It would be totally self-destructive.
Yeah, it's all death. It's all death. And so the way that has supported the economy,
no longer viable.
That
no
can't
longer
that
viable.
can't be sustainable either.
Viable.
No.
There's the external limit, of course, of the planet as well, right? Is the real issue of climate emergency, which is the external limit. But to me, the most interesting one is the internal limit, the creation, the wealth creation, right? It's reached the internal limit, and we don't know how to do it with it anymore. We don't have a plan. We don't have a policy to deal with that. We tried with a Keynesian policy of state spending. That didn't work. It worked up until the mid-70s, and then it turned into stagflation, so stagnant economy with inflation. Then we went into the neoliberal route, with the potentiation of the financial sector, but that today is clearly imploding too. We don't really have an alternative to that. So we need to think of a completely different set of values, a completely different system. We need to think of a systemic change, really. That's the only way that can save, and I think will save us eventually, because as you said, things move before we even realize. Things change, even inside us, right? In our desires, in the way we think and we hope, etc., before we become consciously aware of it. And I think that's the great sort of resilience of humanity, that it can change. It can turn the contradiction, which will never be fully eliminated, because we are contradictory. Human beings are contradictory, right, by definition. But when a contradiction becomes so destructive, like it is today, it needs to be employed or redefined within a different system of values, where it's less destructive, where it's more sustainable. And I think that is the next step that will need to take place at some point, where we live our lives differently, and we subject the categories of our current way of living to some kind of radical criticism, and we think, okay, we cannot live with them any longer, and we reject them, and we embrace new categories, new values, a new language, even, right? A new way of interacting with each other, a new way of understanding the social bond, the social link, a new way of understanding community, a new way of understanding money, perhaps, or whatever we have instead. You mentioned cryptocurrencies. Maybe they could be adapted to a different kind of socialization. At the moment, they don't seem to, and to me at least, they seem to have still very problems that are related to the capitalist system. They're not really related to value production. They're more in terms of kind of on the circulation level. But nevertheless, it's an opening. It's a way of thinking about, for example, taking into consideration the fact that fiat currencies are dying, slowly but surely. They're devaluing themselves. So we need to think of a different way of organizing life, a different social system, a different form of alienation, right? As well, alienation is not just a bad word. We are all, insofar as we're human, we are somewhat alienated, but we need to make that sustainable, and we need to sustain it in terms of common living, of communities, etc. And I'm sure that is will take place, because the only other outcome is destruction. It's slavery. It's mass slavery. It's the totalization of slavery. It's the totalization of a tyrannical system. And I don't think we will allow that to take place, right? I don't think humans will allow that to take place.
No, especially not, what's also coinciding is a revolution of consciousness, and it's the evolution of consciousness mediated in some cases through the psychedelic renaissance, and this revolution of ways that people can access higher states of consciousness, greater levels of interconnectivity, of recognizing that you are not so different from that tree, not so different from that person, not so different and not separate from the entire collective. And these different ways of thinking about the world are coming online at the same time that the economic system that's built on an older consciousness and older ideas, and then reaching its logical conclusion, it's all happening together. And so what you could imagine is a world in which, instead of money mediating relationships, community starts to actually work to support each other, and maybe on a small scale first, but instead of your neighbor just blocked off by the walls and all the mediations of everything else, you start to actually form real communities, and more of like a gift economy where you're actually exchanging and using using a decentralized currency to actually help you, so you don't have to bring, one person doesn't have to bring over steaks and the other person doesn't have to bring over milk,
Right.
and that's all very difficult to do. You can still use currency, but just changing the attitudes around it. And then as labor dries up because automation is taking care of things, then reimagining the contribution of art. And again, I think Burning Man is a great example of this, because in Burning Man, it's just a microcosm. There is no currency that's available, and people just give each other things. It works out. The playa provides, and then the contribution often is art. It's art installations. It's small amounts of art. It's your costume is art. It's kindness, and all of these ways in which you supporting somebody else then becomes built in to the monetary system of exchange. And actually, there's a structure that's being built on cryptocurrency platforms called Zion, in which actual comments and the ways that people put out ideas is then rewarded with sats, with small amounts of Bitcoin. And then there's an exchange of currency, which is actually carrying the information, so it's censorship resistant, but also rewarding just simple interactions. So you could potentially make a living just supporting people who are struggling on this social network, on this platform, or contributing art, and you post your art, or you post a podcast, you post some ideas, a video, an article, and all of a sudden people say, yeah, I really like that. That was great. That added value. That added value to the commons. It added value to the commons, and because it added value to the commons and value to me, let me support you in this way, and mediating it in just a whole different psychology of how we interact with each other and support each other. And naturally, then those people with those things that are dragging society down, putting out negative information, all spreading hate, all of this, there obviously wouldn't be benefiting the commons, and so they wouldn't be rewarded and supported. So it seems like this economic revolution and the consciousness revolution must inherently work kind of hand in hand to create this whole new economic system.
What you said earlier about kind of the necessity of us sort of experiencing this kind of negative trajectory that we're experiencing now, it's absolutely fundamental, because if we didn't, we wouldn't even think about changing it, right? So we need the kind of shock, the trauma, if you like, even, right? We can talk even about the trauma of a system that is imploding, a form of life that is not working any longer. Only if we see that, can we change, our consciousness, as you said, right, and create a different system. Like here, of course, there's the point I think to be made is that there's always a little bit of a disparity between the theory and the practice, right? The theory can never fully work in terms of delineating, the practical aspects, because it doesn't work like that. But you need a bit of theory in order to support some practical solutions, maybe social movements, right? Some kind of social movements that go in a different directions that then will form themselves through their own experiences in terms of creating a different system. So the theory is for me fundamentally a critical theory of what's going on at the moment and the categories of the present that opens up the space for different practices that need to be tried, need to be tested, and they need to work by creating a new set of values fundamentally, right? So, but this is where it's difficult to say what, but I think yes, there will need to be. I think the important thing is that it doesn't become the self-management of poverty, right? That is certainly not what we want. We don't want the self-management of poverty, like people living in some kind of poverty situations outside the big system. I think there needs to be some sort of appropriation of resources. There needs to be a way of making time for different activities that are not related anymore to work, because work will be taken over by machines more and more. So we have this great opportunity to make more of our lives, right? Not subjecting our lives to the routine of alienating sort of bullshit jobs, because the majority of the jobs we have are bullshit jobs, right? People today anyway, they don't want to do them, they have to do them because they have to pay the bills, etc., but they hate them. So machines are going to take over in that respect. There needs to be some kind of socialization of production in that respect, but also the freeing of time, the freeing of space to do other things art, play, leisure. There's many things that we can do with that time that we couldn't do before in a work society, because the work society is driven by work and by profit making and by all those categories that we discussed. Now, all of a sudden, there will be something else. And that is quite shocking and quite new and quite traumatic, I guess, for most people who are used to live, populations who are used to living. But again, those conditions, the condition we're still familiar with, are kind of dying by themselves. So we'll have to, by necessity almost, come up with a different plan, a plan B. The problem with those who are driving our economy today is that they can't even think of a plan B. They don't even want to think of a plan B. They think the plan B is not even possible. It's out of the question. So they continue with the same routine, with the same logic that is driving us down, right? That is driving us to collapse. And I think that's what happened actually to most civilization. When they were in crisis, they continued with the very logic that brought the...
They just doubled down.
They couldn't think of, okay, we need to pull the brakes here. The gravy train has no gravy left, for us anymore. We need to pull the brakes and get off.
Yeah, we can't conquer any more Germanic people. We can't conquer any more Gauls. We've stretched our empire as far as it will go. It will no longer reach, and there's corruption on the inside. And then ultimately, instead of saying like, look, we gotta change everything, pull the borders in, let the people rule themselves outside here, tend our own garden, weed our own garden, take care of all of these things, and then create a new system,
create a new social bond, and redefine completely, radically the concepts, the categories that we have today, including the state, because the state is just, it's not what we think it is, right? Most of the time, it's not at all. It's becoming an oppressive category in the hands of the blackrock that we discussed before, of the big power.
It's like
so
all
things need to change.
All things, including democracy, including economics, including consciousness, including the what we value as valuable. And I think that idea that play is inherently valuable. And so in some way in which play in a productive way is rewarded. I think of like rec leagues and basketball leagues and ways in which people are playing, and all of a sudden there's energy of actually like, oh, this is your contribution. You're showing up to this pickup basketball game so that 9 other people at the same time can play basketball and experience something that's meaningful. Like that has inherent value. That has value to the people playing. It has value to those who get out that energy and then come back to their families. And there's value there, and instead, but we're not actually thinking of that like, oh yeah, even though that's just basketball, there's some value there. And there's some value in all of these different other fields that need to come into our consciousness and then somehow be woven into our economics. And then also the sovereignty of the individual being rewarded and encouraged and nourished so that we can actually make policy decisions about who our leaders are and have emergent leaders that actually represent this new consciousness.
And that doesn't mean that work will be completely eliminated. Of course, we will have to work one way or another, but less, much less than we've been working so far, and we can therefore devote our lives to other activities. And so. Yeah, I think this is the only way out, reinventing the system quite radically. I think that's the only way. The system cannot be mended anymore. That's the fundamental point. Cannot be adjusted. The reformist approach is now exhausted itself, right? There's no way of reforming the system any longer. It will come to the point where we will realize that there's nothing else we can do apart from reconfiguring it, quite radically, from starting from each and every category, each and every value that today think it's almost natural, but it's not. It's
yeah. So what do you think people can do? If people are looking at this and they're saying, "Oh shit, the old system is not working," and what do we do besides just spreading ideas and spreading consciousness and spreading awareness and loving people through this process? Is there anything that you can see that people can do with their own assets, with their own mind? And I think it's very easy to slip into this, again, more solipsism. Let me get my own bunker set up and let me point guns at anybody who wants to come into my bunker. But fundamentally, no one wants to shoot anybody that's hungry.
No.
You know, like what world is that? Are you really, someone's hungry and you're like, you can't come in. They're like, please give me some of
Mm.
your beef jerky. Like I'm
Yeah,
going to die. Like, what is the idea that you're just going to leave them out there and watch them on your fucking webcam, watch them die slowly? No, you're going to give them water and give them food
of
because we
course. No,
love
that
each other fundamentally. So that strategy is not going to really work
there needs to begin to
either.
be new forms of solidarity, including mutual aid, in relating to food, relating to money, to whatever we have. There has to be new forms of solidarity that the kickstart, the trigger the new system, which is will be as complex as the previous one, and will be based on some categories that we have to internalize in our unconscious, right, and think of as natural. They need to be built into us, into humans, because that's how societies work, right? It's never fully transparent. There's always a degree of opacity in the social link that we can't really
Mm-hmm.
understand, but it works, right? Um, so, and it takes a while. It will take a while, but I think people need to keep an open mind, right, to others. To precisely in this sense of, I can see social movements growing in that respect, right? First, maybe nationally,
Yeah.
first locally, and then internationally, and then everywhere. But they will need to connect, network, in the name of new forms of solidarity based on different categories from the ones we have now. And I think it will inevitably happen. I'm quite optimistic in that respect. So there's a sense of pessimism in relation to this system. This system is not going to be mended. But there's optimism insofar as I think humans will always come up with some creative solution, that will drive the,
Yeah.
the way they live together. No, individualism is not the solution. You cannot live on your own. You're a social animal by definition. You need others. Others are what make
Yeah.
you who you are, right? This is the fundamental sort of discursive law about any social bond. You become yourself because you inherit stuff from others, whether from your culture or from the others around you, your parents in the first place, but also your peers, your family. You are what they are in a sense, and then you create yourself out of that influence. So
Mm.
you got to start from there, to realizing that's the only starting point. Um,
Yeah. It's happening in interesting ways. It's just happening through a system that's flawed. I mean, the Black Lives Matter, kind of revolution that happened in 2020 as well. Massive outpourings of support. And of course, there's challenges to how that organization
right.
utilized the resources, and there's some issues with how it all played out. But the impetus is beautiful.
Yeah,
People caring, people really caring and wanting to support something
I
that
agree.
mattered to them. Mattered to caring for a part of, a disenfranchised part of the population, and a
This is
systemic
interesting.
injustice. People really caring. So that was like a noble, beautiful thing, but it still didn't quite hit the ground in the way, and it was still navigated and manipulated in ways, and so it wasn't a perfect execution, but the
Yeah,
idea was beautiful. And same with the
right.
trucker convoys, right? Like a bunch of money pours in to support the truckers for standing up against these kind of tyrannical mandates that they're saying, no, you can't impose this. And then people donating a bunch of money. But of course, that system was flawed because that money got frozen, and then prevented from actually reaching. So then new systems emerged, like, okay, you donate this way, we promise
Yeah.
it's going to get to the truckers. A new system emerges as the old system tries to choke up and stay to
And
its
also, even
own.
more than that, because the old system tries to manipulate populations to do certain things, but precisely from that manipulation, something good can come. Insofar as those people, once they're
Mm,
together, they can realize that they can go against the very people who've manipulated them into believing the same thing. So things can happen, and things can be uncontrollable. I don't believe that those who are in power today, those who really kind of we could regard as the puppeteers of the show, that they can ever establish a form of totality, of total control over people, because things will go wrong by definition, for those who are in power too. They cannot
mm,
they cannot control absolutely everything. Very often, what they think they are controlling will revolt against them. Very, this is bound to
yeah.
happen because the contradiction operates, precisely in that way too. And that's how it is useful to have a contradiction, because it means that you cannot totalize a field. You cannot totalize a field completely. there's always something that escapes your attempt at totalization. And to me, I'm very interested in psychoanalysis, for example. I believe that there is an unconscious, and I think the unconscious is the contradiction that prevents things from working, right? The unconscious is precisely what makes you say something that you don't want to say, but then all of a sudden, what you said has more meaning than what you thought, you were going to have. So I think it's a fundamental issue that we need to keep in mind, that shouldn't sort of drive us down. It shouldn't be made to make us too negative and too pessimistic, because in that very attempt at totalizing, there's the solution. There's something will go wrong and will create the possibility and another set of conditions, outside that attempt of totalization.
And it's also very good for the individual psychology, because we could freeze in our own absolute fear. It's all ruining. The world's coming down, the sky is falling, and then all of a sudden we get locked in our own fear.
Is the
and
worst
fear
thing. Absolutely.
Being a constrictive agent, it's going to limit our creativity, limit our ability to actually make decisions that make sense. Everybody knows you make horrible decisions when you're afraid. So, instead thinking like, all right, there's a lot of pressure and there's going to be a lot of challenges that come, but I believe in people. I believe in myself. I believe in my ability to help navigate and steward this new consciousness that's emerging, these new systems that are emerging. Just have a little trust, have a little trust in humanity. I mean, we've gone through all kinds of crazy shit, volcanic eruptions and floods and ice ages, and we didn't even have technology and tools. We just put on as much fur as we could and walked hopefully towards some place that was a little bit fucking warmer, because our toes were freezing off, and we figured it out, like one way or another. Like human beings, we're tough and we're resilient and we're strong. And when pressed down to the last bit, there's something that emerges. Absolutely. There's something that emerges from us. And that's the beautiful part about us, is that there's something strong and heroic and beautiful. I really believe at the core of all humans. It cannot
be controlled from above, right? And I think that's what pissed me off the most about the use of fear in all this. They really have instilled fear into sort of large, parts of the population, and that's terrible. The fact in which that's the worst bit of it. But anyway, that's. I think we should be optimistic, despite maybe precisely because things are going belly up, we should kind of be optimistic that something new can come, a new discourse, a new set of values can emerge from this.
Yeah. And I guess that's, just to reiterate my final message, like, think of all the times, anybody listening, think of all the times that you've had a challenge that you couldn't figure out. You just couldn't figure out how you were going to deal with this. Maybe you lost your job, or maybe things didn't work out. I can have countless examples of these moments where it felt like I have no idea what I'm going to do. There's no way out of this thing. And then the pressure stays, and then you get creative and you get innovative, and then you get inspired, and then you move forward in spite of the difficulty. And then all of a sudden the solution, which wasn't available to you now, was available for you, just sticking the path and sticking it out and holding faith. And then all of a sudden this new branch of possibility opens up, and then, you move your energy to that. And so I think it's as much about just trusting each other and trusting ourselves in this time, and being curious. What's going to happen? We don't know what's going to happen. These are some dangers. Let's be mindful of the dangers, and let's try to steer this entire ship, which we're all a part of. We all have an oar on the collective boat of humanity, and we all have the opportunity to steer it. But if we're steering against each other, the boat's going to sink. We got to continue to move in a positive way.
You've said it. There's not much more that I can add. I think we've said it all, and I appreciate the opportunity you're giving me to talk about this. I really do.
Of course. I appreciate all the work that you've put out. So many of your articles, which are brilliantly written, are on the Philosophical Salon. So I'll offer those notes, and I'll give the exact links in the show notes. And I encourage people to take a look and read. I mean, timelines of how all of the financial pieces have worked all the way from the beginning, the challenges that you've talked about through these different industrial revolutions, through all of the ways that it's played out in the last 3 years. And there's a lot of really potent information there. Ideas that extend, you're a philosopher by nature, so it extends even beyond economics, but into psychology and into so many different areas that we've touched on a little bit. But it was just a real pleasure to read your work and be aware of some of the things that, I was personally just blind to. You can get very myopic in what you look at. And I think what you've done is just said, no, let's continue to look deeper, all the way back to that source, the source point, which is the entity of money itself.
Right.
Let's look all the way back into the core of the system, and then try to make sense of everything from the full perspective.
It's a rabbit hole, and you have to go down and down, and you're driven by your curiosity, and sometimes it's painful and frustrating, but it's worth doing it, and the deep dive you take, I think, is very rewarding in the end, even if it's a bit painful sometimes, and but still, that's it's something that you do because you do it, because you cannot not do it, in a sense, right? Once you kind of hooked into that sort of, it becomes a kind of addiction. And I didn't know much either, right? But COVID made me so curious about all this, because I just couldn't explain it in another way. There was no, I kind of saw it from the beginning. I mean, I couldn't believe what they were doing. It was just, this disproportion was huge, right? All these measures that they never implemented before. And I'm asking myself, why are they doing it? And you've got to look into the very, I think, the root cause of our own existence today to understand what is actually going on.
Yeah, indeed.
Thank you.
Fabio,
thank you, Aubrey.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, my friend. Absolutely. And we'll put out all the links so people can read more from you and all that. And I look forward to continuing the discussion and dialogue as more things unfold, and look forward to reading your next articles whenever they come out, and get a chance to see through your eyes and your perspective the things that people like me that don't know as much about macroeconomics. We had a little call before this just so I could get a little grasp on some of these economic concepts, because it's a little high level, but you did a great job explaining it, and hopefully we did so again today on this podcast, at least a sufficient job. And so once again, thank you. And
thank you, Aubrey.
We'll be in touch.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
There's two choices the person has. Wait for the world to bring the darkness upon them, or they can go out and find the darkness and prepare for the inevitable challenges that the world brings.
I spent 7 days in pitch darkness, isolation, and silence. It's called a darkness retreat. Just
Dark
complete
therapy.
darkness.
I want to do that.
So here's my little room. That's pretty much it. A little Four Seasons. It's a funny thing to be frightened of your own mind. Frightened of the dark.
The Chavin shamans would go down into the catacomb of Chavin. So they would go down into the darkness of these catacombs, snort the Vilka, become the jaguar, and emerge as the jaguar shamans. I knew at that point, I'm going into the darkness.
It's one of the oldest tools, our ability to alter our state of consciousness willingly.
Blackness used to be a nightly thing for us.
Darkness has been with us since the beginning of our evolutionary history.
How come the mind keeps coming back?
The brain is an incredible thing. It takes light and sound and constructs our entire reality.
I really miss my life. And now I'm in an ayahuasca vision that just won't shut off. Permanent dark ayahuasca. It's all just as it should be. This is the end of the book. Love what is. I love what is. I love what is. I love what is.
Thanks for tuning into this video. Make sure you hit subscribe, follow me at Aubrey Marcus, check out the Aubrey Marcus podcast, available everywhere, and leave a comment. Let me know if this video resonated or what else you would like to hear from me in the future. Thank you so much.